September 19th, 1944, Lorraine, France. Dawn crawled over a fog-soaked valley. The smell of diesel and wet earth clung to the air as American Sherman tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, crept forward through the mist. Somewhere ahead, hidden behind the haze, German Panther tanks waited, their 75mm high-velocity guns ready to slice through anything that moved. For months, the Sherman crews had lived in terror of those big cats. The Panther's sloped armor was nearly invincible to the standard 75mm round. A Sherman could fire and fire, and the shells would bounce off like pebbles against steel. Every encounter was a gamble of who spotted who first, and usually it wasn't the Americans. But this morning, something was different. Sergeant Charles Red Brown loaded a new kind of shell into the breech, one the Germans didn't even know existed. It was shorter, denser, and gleamed like polished brass. The M93 HVP, high-velocity armor-piercing round, its tungsten core engineered to punch through armor thought to be untouchable. Through the gun sight, Brown spotted the faint silhouette of a panther crossing the ridge. He whispered, "Target, 800 yards." The gun thundered. For a heartbeat, silence. Then, a plume of black smoke erupted from the Panther's side. The impossible had just happened. For the first time, a Sherman had killed a Panther head-on. Back into index pointing right before we dive into how this illegal miracle round changed the battlefield. Make sure you're following, because what came next would stun German intelligence and rewrite the balance of armored warfare forever. Summer 1944, Normandy. The hedgerows of France hid nightmares for the American armored forces. Every time a Sherman rounded a corner, the fields could come alive with the deafening crack of an 88mm gun or the metallic roar of a Panther tank shifting into ambush position. Within seconds, flames would engulf another Sherman, and its crew of 5 barely had time to escape. The M4 Sherman was America's workhorse, fast, reliable, and built in staggering numbers. But when it came to sheer firepower, it was hopelessly outclassed. The standard 75mm gun, though effective against lighter German tanks like the Panzer IV, simply couldn't penetrate the thick, sloped armor of the Panther. The Panther, or Panzerkampfwagen V, had entered service in 1943, designed in direct response to the shock of the Soviet T-34. It combined heavy armor with terrifying mobility. Its KWK 42L/70 cannon could destroy a Sherman from nearly 2 kilometers away, long before the Americans were even in range to fight back. To the U.S. tank crews in France, these new German machines seemed unstoppable. Reports from Normandy painted a grim picture. Panthers lurking in hedgerows, firing the first and only shot of an engagement. The aftermath was almost always the same: smoking wrecks, blackened steel, and charred helmets lying in the mud. By mid-1944, tank commanders were begging for a weapon that could stand chance. One frustrated officer wrote in his after-action report, "The men go into battle knowing the enemy's first round is likely to kill them. They fight anyway, but they know the odds." The U.S. Ordnance Department had known about this problem for years. Back in 1942, while America's factories were still ramping up production, engineers realized that even the planned 76mm upgrade wouldn't fully solve the problem. The gun could fire faster and flatter, but not necessarily harder. The enemy's armor was evolving faster than America's shells. The key challenge wasn't the gun. It was the ammunition. Traditional armor-piercing, AP, rounds relied on hardened steel cores that deformed or shattered when hitting thick, sloped armor. German tanks like the Panther used face-hardened plates that could deflect rounds even when struck nearly head-on. The only way to beat that was with velocity and density, a round that hit harder and faster than any before. But that kind of material wasn't easy to come by. To make such a projectile, you needed tungsten, one of the hardest, densest metals known to man. And tungsten was rare. America's supply came mostly from China and Portugal, and even then, it was limited. The War Production Board considered it too valuable for mass production. It was already in high demand for cutting tools, armor-piercing shells, and aircraft components. Still, the Ordnance Department pushed forward. Deep inside Aberdeen Proving Ground, ballistics engineers began experimenting with a radical idea, replacing the steel core of a standard armor-piercing round with a small, ultra-dense tungsten penetrator, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum or steel jacket. The new shell would be lighter overall, but could travel at much higher speeds, focusing all that energy on a tiny impact point. In theory, it could slice through armor that no other round could touch. The first prototypes were fired in early 1943. On the test range, a modified 76mm gun hurled the new M93 high-velocity armor-piercing HVP round downrange at speeds over 3,400 feet per second, nearly 30% faster than the standard AP shot. When it hit, it didn't just dent armor, it drilled through it. Test results stunned the engineers. Against simulated German plates angled at 55 degrees, the M93 penetrated over 5 inches, 130 millimeters of steel at 500 yards. For the first time, the Sherman had a bullet that could kill a panther. But there was a catch. Each round required several ounces of tungsten, a strategic material the Allies couldn't waste. The U.S. Army could never produce enough HVAP rounds to fully equip every tank. That meant they had to be distributed sparingly, one crate here, one there, given only to frontline units expected to face the heaviest armor. By the time of the Normandy breakout, just a few tank battalions had seen the new ammunition. Even fewer had tested it in combat. Most crews still carried standard 75mm and 76mm shells, which meant if they encountered panthers or tigers, they had to rely on flanking shots or luck. Still, hope was spreading quietly through the ranks. Whispers of a new round that could cut through a panther like butter. Some even called it the miracle bullet. But the ordnance engineers knew it was more science than miracle. The round was fragile, expensive, and limited. It had to be handled carefully and fired precisely. It was no magic solution, but in the right hands, it could change the balance. That hope became a reality in September 1944, when elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army clashed with the German 5th Panzer Army near the town of Ericourt. There, amid the morning fog and the wreckage of Lorraine, the first Shermans loaded with HVAP rounds went to war. And that's when the Germans began to realize something had changed. Spring 1943, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. In a long, echoing workshop filled with the hum of lathes and the acrid scent of burnt metal, a group of American ordnance engineers were racing against time. German tanks were getting tougher with each new model, and reports from Europe and North Africa made it clear America's guns were falling behind. At a corner test bench, a young ballistics engineer named Charles E. Hyde scribbled calculations across a chalkboard. His idea was radical. If a tank shell couldn't rely on brute mass to pierce armor, then maybe speed and density could do the job instead. Velocity is armor's worst enemy, Hyde told his team. We need something that flies faster, hits harder, and doesn't break on impact. That simple statement would lead to the creation of one of World War II's most advanced and most secret anti-tank rounds, the M93 HVP, high-velocity armor-piercing projectile. The concept wasn't new. British and German engineers had already experimented with tungsten core ammunition, known respectively as APCR, armor-piercing composite rigid, and PGR .40 rounds. But the United States had something those nations didn't: industrial might and mass production capacity. What America didn't have, however, was tungsten. This silvery gray metal, nearly twice as dense as steel, was essential for machine tools, armor-piercing shells, and even aircraft propellers. In 1943, the world's largest suppliers of tungsten were China, Portugal, and Bolivia, nations caught between Allied and Axis trade pressures. To secure enough of it, American intelligence quietly launched an operation codenamed Project Tungsten. Diplomats and agents worked through neutral countries, using front companies to buy or before the Germans could. Shipments were routed through India, South Africa, and Brazil, all under tight secrecy. Every ounce mattered. Meanwhile, at Aberdeen, Hyde's team designed a shell unlike any the U.S. Army had ever fired. The M93 used a subcaliber tungsten carbide core encased in a lightweight aluminum alloy sabot. When fired, the sabot gripped the round, sealing gas pressure and maximizing acceleration. The moment it left the barrel, the sabot fell away, leaving only the dense penetrator to streak toward its target. The result was astonishing. On the range, a 76mm gun firing the new HVP shell achieved muzzle velocities of 3,400 to 3,600 feet per second, nearly 30% faster than the standard 76mm M62 APC round. Test plates representing Panther and Tiger armor shattered like glass under its impact. Engineers recorded penetration figures that made even seasoned officers whistle in disbelief. At 500 yards, 140 millimeters of steel angled at 30 degrees. At 1,000 yards, 120 millimeters. Suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. The Sherman's gun, once mocked as underpowered, could, in theory, kill any German tank in existence. But there were problems. Tungsten was too scarce to make enough HVAP rounds for every unit. A single round used almost 1/10 of a pound of tungsten carbide, meaning that just 10,000 shells consumed over a ton of the precious metal. High Command made a painful decision. The HVAP would be classified as limited standard. It would be produced only in small quantities and issued to units most likely to face heavy German armor, namely the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Armor Divisions operating under Patton's 3rd Army. That meant most tank crews never even saw an HVAP round during the war. And those who did often received only a few boxes, sometimes just 2 to 5 rounds per tank. Tankers treated them like gold. One crewman from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion later recalled, "We kept them in a separate box under the floorboards. HVAP was for Panthers only. If we fired one, it meant we were desperate or angry." By mid-1944, small shipments of M93 rounds began arriving in England, just as American units prepared for the Normandy invasion. Testing at Lulworth Cove and Ordnance Depot No. 9 confirmed their effectiveness, but also revealed their limitations. Because the round was lighter, it lost velocity quickly over long distances, making it effective mostly under 1,000 yards. Beyond that, it struggled against the heavy front armor of Tigers. But at close to medium range, it was devastating, especially when aimed at the Panther's thinner side plates and turret cheeks. The Ordnance Department issued a warning in every HVAP crate: do not waste against light targets. Reserved for Mark V and Mark VI enemy armor. Tankers took the warning seriously. The shells were rare enough that commanders often ordered them withheld until the exact moment a Panther was spotted. Crews learned to recognize their distinct blue-tipped noses, the sign of a weapon that might save their lives. As production ramped up in 1944, the HVAP became a quiet obsession among frontline units. Crews would trade cigarettes, rations, or even spare parts just to get a few extra rounds. In after-action reports, officers began describing miraculous kills. Panthers knocked out frontally at 600 or 700 yards. But the Germans noticed, too. By the late summer of 1944, Panther crews were reporting mysterious super shells that punched through armor that had previously been invulnerable. At first, German analysts dismissed it as bad luck or weak steel. But when wreck after wreck showed clean penetrations straight through the glacis, they realized something had changed. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., the engineers at Aberdeen and Watertown Arsenal continued refining the VAPS design. They developed improved sabots and balanced the round for higher accuracy at range. Each new batch shipped out quietly, marked only by serial numbers and a simple label: M93 for 76mm gun, limited distribution. In secrecy, America had created a weapon the enemy didn't even know existed, one built from science, scarcity, and sheer desperation. And soon, on the foggy fields of Lorraine, it would prove itself for the first time. September 19th, 1944. Dawn rattled the hedgerows of Lorraine with a thin, creeping fog. For weeks the Allies had been pouring through France, breaking bocage, hunting retreating columns, chasing whispers of German counterattacks. But few believed that a handful of lightweight projectiles, forged from rare metal and smuggled into ammunition racks like contraband, could change the face of armored warfare. They were wrong. That morning, in a low, patchwork line of hedgerows outside Ericourt, Captain Kenneth R. Lamison's C Company of the 37th Tank Battalion lay in wait. Their Shermans hunched behind embankments, engines idling, breath steaming in the cool air. Each tank carried something unusual in its stowage. 6 M93 HVAP rounds, the gold of tank ammunition. In many crews they were treated like family heirlooms, kept separate, counted, and discussed in whispers. These shells weren't meant for chasing half-track or soft-skin trucks. They were reserved for the moment a Panther, the new, feared German medium tank, showed its face. The fog lifted, and the first Panther did exactly that. A silhouette in the gray, its long 75mm KWK 42 gun peering like an accusation through the mist. At 75 meters, tactical conditions collapsed. Range advantage disappeared, optics blurred. The Panther's famed long-shot capability was useless. The Sherman's gunner didn't hesitate. He chambered a single HVAP, and when it left the muzzle, the air itself seemed to crack. The tungsten cord penetrator, the M93's secret, slammed into the Panther's gun mantlet. The strike was surgical. The mantlet, once thought near invulnerable, gave way. Secondary explosions followed. Ammunition cooked off, the turret rose from the hull in a violent breath, and the Panther became a burning stump. Men who had learned to flinch at the sight of a Panther now stood still, mouths open. The word impossible ran down the line like a contagion. 3 more Panthers advanced blindly into the fog. 3 more HVAP rounds, 3 more kills. By noon, the German advance was broken. American tanks, once resigned to flanking and evasive tactics, were on the offensive again. Why did this work? On paper, the Panther was a marvel. Sloped glacis, curved cast mantlet, and a powerful gun that had dominated engagements from the front. But physics will answer where doctrine fails. The M93 used a tungsten carbide core, extremely hard, extremely dense, seated inside a lightweight aluminum carrier. When fired from the 76mm, the sabot design allowed muzzle velocities to climb into the 3,400 to 3,600 feet per second range. Kinetic energy concentrates, and where mass alone could not pierce, velocity and density could. At combat ranges under 1,000 yards, particularly in the fog and hedgerow chaos of Lorraine, that concentrated punch turned the Panther's mantlet from armor into brittle metal. The Battle of Ericourt was not only tactical, it was psychological. Panther crews had been trained to trust their frontal armor. They had been told the Sherman couldn't hurt them unless they exposed their sides. That myth dissolved in a matter of hours. Wrecked Panthers littered the fields, turrets cratered, crews scrambled from burning steel with stunned eyes. German radio traffic filled with stunned messages, reports of blue-tipped rounds, of penetrations at ranges once thought impossible. The rumor mill produced terrible theories, secret Allied tank destroyers, 17-pounder Fireflies in American markings. The truth was quieter and more damning. American metallurgy and logistics had produced a scarce but lethal projectile, HVAP, and had placed it, sparingly, in the hands of crews who wasted no time learning to use it. But the early victories weren't inevitable. HVAP arrived in America's arsenals amid debate and disbelief. Production was painfully slow. Tungsten was a scarce commodity, and each round consumed precious supply. In the summer of 1944, most tanks carried just a handful of M93 rounds, sometimes 2, more often 5. Crews learned that these were not consumables to be fired in anger at light tanks or trucks. A single HVAP shot was a decision, not just tactically, but emotionally and logistically. Commanders rationed them, issue tables frowned on their profligate use, and ordnance officers scrambled to make more. This scarcity shaped tactics. Tank commanders were instructed to preserve HVAP for true heavy threats. When a Panther appeared, everything else in the engagement shifted to create a favorable angle. Concealment, hull-down positions, close approach. Fire discipline became as important as marksmanship. The VAP's high muzzle velocity meant it was devastating at medium ranges but lost performance over extreme distances. Crews learned to accept that an HVAP engagement was a close-range, decisive gamble. Ericourt proved those gambles could pay off. The HVAP didn't make the Sherman magically superior. It made it lethal when opportunity presented. Panthers that had counted on frontal survivability now had to hesitate, deploy more carefully, and avoid head-on exposures, exactly the conditions that favored the Allies' combined arms doctrine. Across subsequent weeks, the pattern repeated. In forests, fog, and fields where tank maneuver could be constrained, the same places where German technical superiority had once seemed insurmountable, HVAP-equipped Shermans began to score frontal penetrations that had been unimaginable months earlier. The arrival of M93 rounds also forced a redistribution of initiative. American crews grew more willing to engage German tanks instead of ceding ground and calling for artillery. Confidence, once frayed by the Panthers' reputation, began to rebuild. But Ericourt also highlighted VAP's limitations. The tungsten core was brittle, at low impact velocities, the result of long-range shots or high obliquity angles. The penetrator could shatter rather than pierce. The M93's advantage sharply declined beyond roughly 1,000 yards. Logistics remained a headache. By March 1945, only about 33,000 rounds had been produced for the 76 millimeters, a meaningful number, yet nowhere near enough to fully rearm entire formations. Officers scrambled to allocate, prioritize, and hoard. Men learned to hold their breath and fire only when the shot would count. German forces took notice quickly and reacted not just tactically but emotionally. The psychology of armored warfare is subtle. A crew that believes in its invulnerability fights with a certain audacity. Remove that belief, and tactics calcify, aggressiveness diminishes. Panthers began to operate more cautiously, reluctant to stand and trade shots at ranges where American 76 mm guns might now be lethal. The Wehrmacht's numerical and technical problems were compounding, and HVAP, scarce though it was, became a force multiplier for Allied momentum. Ericourt's legacy extended beyond one day or one regiment. It proved a principle, that material scarcity could be mitigated by smart application, and that a small change in capability, 6 tungsten cores in an ammunition rack, could ripple across a battlefield to change decisions and doctrine. It also exposed how industrial capacity and resource control would decide the war more surely than isolated technical brilliance. The Allies' ability to secure tungsten supplies, scale HVAP production, albeit slowly, and distribute rounds where they mattered, that systemic advantage mattered as much as the metallurgy. By September's end, American crews were talking less about Panther invincibility. They talked about angles, ranges, and the blue-tipped flash of an HVAP impacting steel. They talked about how to make a Panther present its weakest face. And in quiet mess halls, they passed around the same fact. You did not need to equal the enemy at every point. You needed to find the moment where your small advantage became decisive. The M93 had found that moment. War is often decided not in a single firefight, but in the quiet calculus of supply tables, resource maps, and the ledger books of ministries. If Part 3 showed what HVAP could do on a hedgerow morning at Ericourt, Part 4 asked the harder question: how did a handful of blue-tipped rounds get from melting pot to muzzle? The answer is tungsten, dense, brittle, strategic, and the political and industrial choreography required to turn that into battlefield certainty. Tungsten was the hidden currency of late-war armor solutions. In the laboratory, it was almost magical. Tungsten carbide cores concentrated mass and hardness into a microscopic sphere capable of shattering steel obliquities that ordinary projectiles glance from. In the real world, it was scarce, expensive, and contested. Pre-war, China supplied a large share of global tungsten, often quoted as roughly a third, and by 1944 world production figures looked like a map of disrupted trade routes. The Allies could import some tungsten from friendly sources and ramp domestic extraction from tiny U.S. deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California. Germany, cut off from many of its suppliers and under strategic bombing, faced a harsher reality. The HVAP story is therefore inseparable from logistics. The M93 T4 in development nomenclature was not a miracle cartridge that could be mass-produced overnight. Each round consumed something on the order of 0.8 to 0.9 kilograms of tungsten carbide, small in absolute terms, vast in context of 1944 material flows. Early production in the summer of 1944 was painfully slow. Prototype and pilot runs moved forward while combat units begged for more. The numbers tell the tale of scarcity and scramble. Ordnance reports show production measured in the low thousands through late 1944. Initial monthly outputs were counted in the low thousands, augury of 1,000 rounds here, 1,000 there, climbing as factories retooled and supply chain stabilized. By November 1944, monthly output approached 5,000 rounds, and by January 1945, manufacturers were producing roughly 7,000 rounds per month. By March 1945, cumulative production reached about 33,000 rounds for the 76 millimeters. Meaningful, but still a drop in the bucket relative to the tens of thousands of tanks in the European theater. That scarcity created policy decisions with teeth. Who got the shots? Tank destroyers, the units specifically designed to hunt enemy armor, received priority. Certain frontline units, when planners judged they were most likely to meet Panthers or Tigers, were issued a small allocation. Most Sherman crews, however, found themselves carrying only a handful, sometimes as few as 5 HVAP rounds per tank. That one detail explains 100 tactical choices. Why tankers conserved shots, why commanders ordered flanking maneuvers instead of frontal engagements, why a single HVAP became a champ of its own. A last resort token kept for the moment the whole company froze. Logistics also meant paperwork and politics. The Ordnance Department had tested HVAP since 1942, but procurement through wartime bureaucracy required raw materials, press tooling, and cartridge casings. Each step another choke point. The strategic rivalry for tungsten extended even to neutral countries. Sweden, a key European source, was a diplomatic chess piece. Germany had long relied on Swedish tungsten, but wartime diplomacy and Allied pressure choked many of those flows. Simultaneously, Allied intelligence and procurement teams searched global markets and wartime partners to secure enough or to feed expanding HVAP lines. Every ton of tungsten allocated to ammunition was, in someone's ledger, money not spent on machine tools or other war industries, an ethical and strategic choice that reached from factory foremen to cabinet ministers. On the battlefield, that arithmetic showed up quickly. When the Ardennes offensive erupted in December 1944, the German counterstroke collided with American units whose HVAP stocks were unpredictable. Some tank companies had enough rounds to engage Panthers confidently. Others ran dry within days. Snow and mud complicated resupply, and road convoys were vulnerable to artillery and air interdiction. The shortage of HVAP in those desperate weeks was no small factor in operational friction. Commanders who ran out of blue-tipped rounds had to rely on older tactics, flanking, bazookas, artillery, or withdraw. Conversely, units that still had HVAP could blunt Panther attacks with a narrow but decisive edge. Germany's side of the ledger is revealing. The Reich understood tungsten's importance early. German engineers had developed similar subcaliber designs, the Panzergranate 40 series, but industry could not match the Allies' output. Sweden's diminishing exports, Allied interdiction, and bombing of German transport and production left the Wehrmacht hoarding tungsten for essential tool production and aircraft engines. The consequence: Panthers and Tigers often fought with standard rounds that would not penetrate when engaged frontally. The industrial arithmetic, who had access to strategic raw materials and the manufacturing organic capacity to turn them into specialized ammunition, mattered as much as armor slope tables. Production constraints also shaped doctrine. American ordnance officers emphasized education. HVAP was not a spray-and-pray solution. The tungsten core performed best at higher velocities and favorable impact angles. Beyond 1,000 meters, its benefits dropped sharply, and at high obliquity, the core could shatter on impact. Crews thus learned, sometimes by bitter experience, that HVAP was most reliable at medium ranges and near normal impact angles. Training briefs emphasized shot discipline. Hold the round until you had a shot that counted. That doctrine converted a scarcity into a multiplier. One carefully placed HVP could neutralize a panther that would otherwise force an entire company to maneuver and waste time and men. Still, the Allies did more than ration. They innovated on the margins. Cartridge designs optimized ballistic coefficients and sabot carriers to maximize muzzle velocity, and manufacturing techniques improved to reduce tungsten waste during fabrication. Procurement teams cultivated new sources, some in South America, some in less obvious mining districts, and diplomatic channels worked overtime to secure the ore. By early 1945, production had improved enough to make HVAP a recurring factor on European battlefields, though never in the quantities frontline commanders would have preferred. The psychological effect, however, outpaced sheer tonnage. Stories from crews who saw panther mantlets burst under blue-tipped strikes spread faster than production could. In the fog of war, reputation matters. Once panthers stopped feeling invulnerable, German tactics shifted toward caution, fewer bold maneuvers, and more reliance on prepared positions and ambush. That change in temperament, multiplied across units and fronts, was as strategically consequential as dozens of lost tanks. The Allies' ability to produce a scarce but decisive material and get it to the men who needed it at the right moment changed enemy behavior. Post-war echoes validate the lesson. In Korea, when tungsten supply pressure eased and stocks were plentiful, HVAP and similar high-velocity penetrators became routine. The same metallurgical principle, a dense, hard core delivered at high speed, returned to center stage in Cold War ammunition designs, and modern APFSDS rounds trace conceptual continuity back to those blue-tipped experiments. But in 1944, the limiting factor wasn't metallurgy. It was logistics and geopolitics. The country that solved the supply puzzle fastest and at the largest scale held a decisive edge. Ericourt was the first visible demonstration of VAP's battlefield potency. The months that followed were the slow, grinding work of converting a scarce strategic metal into an operational advantage. Factory foremen, ordnance clerks, diplomatic envoys, and miners, invisible in the glory narratives, were as crucial to the story as the crews who fired the rounds. The tungsten buried in those projectiles was literally a commodity of victory. Heavy, valuable, and fought over in boardrooms and mines as fiercely as in hedgerows. When the next Panther rolled into view and a Sherman gunner drew breath, the decision to fire was never purely tactical. It was arithmetic and politics made palpable. A kilogram of tungsten, a ration round, a soldier's life, a battalion's momentum. That uncomfortable intersection of metallurgy and logistics, of greed and necessity, turned small blue tips into strategic reverberations that helped unmake German armor doctrine. Technology mattered. The tungsten core, the muzzle velocity, the ballistics tables, but on the ground it all came down to human choices made in a matter of seconds. Part 5 examines that crucible, how crews were taught to use HVAP, how companies conserved and allocated those precious rounds, how commanders turned logistics into tactics, and how individual courage and judgment multiplied the cartridge's value. First, the classroom. Ordnance reports and field bulletins circulated rapidly after the first HVAP deployments in late summer 1944. Crews were briefed that HVAP was not a magic bullet to be sprayed, but a scalpel to be used sparingly. The ballistics were unforgiving. The tungsten carbide core delivered its advantage through velocity. Muzzle velocity for the M93/T4 HVAP came in at roughly 1,036 meters per second, compared with about 792 meters per second for the standard M62 APC. That extra speed translated into vastly improved penetration. At roughly 1,000 yards, almost equals 914 m, HVAP could penetrate on the order of 160 millimeters at 10 degrees obliquity, enough under the right conditions to punch through a panther's mantlet. But velocity fell with distance, and the brittle tungsten core could shatter on oblique impacts or after losing speed. Doctrine, therefore, emphasized range discipline, placed the round where its velocity and angle would produce real effect. Gunnery practice changed. Where previously tank gunners trained to make rapid, multiple-shot engagements at ranges judged visually, HVAP doctrine trained them to estimate ranges accurately, to adjust for obliquity, and to identify weak points, turret mantlets, vision slits, side plates exposed during pivots, and tracks at very close quarters. Forward observers and spotters were taught to call out ranges in meters, not vague close or long labels. Crews practiced using rangefinders, mill reticles, and mapped engagement zones. The training stressed that an HVAP round fired at the glacis at a steep angle was wasteful. A single mantlet hit, however, could eliminate a panther's gun or trigger a catastrophic secondary detonation when it hit ammunition stowed behind the breech. Shot discipline became cultural. A tank commander who fired HVAP at first contact risked being ostracized by his peers if that round turned out to be the one his company needed minutes later. Implementation varied by unit, but frontline practice converged on a few common rules of thumb. Hold HVAP for confirmed armored targets at ranges under 1,000 m and near normal impact angles. Prefer standard AP or HE for soft targets or long-range harassing fire. Use HVAP to kill the turret/gun when a frontal penetration was necessary to break a duel. Those rules were learned quickly, sometimes at cost. The human stories illustrate how doctrine met reality. Sergeant Francis Baker's November 20th engagement, noted in many unit reports, shows both the potential and the pitfalls. Baker's Sherman engaged a Panther at roughly 800 yards and scored multiple hits with HVAP. Yet the rounds bounced off the glacis inside at oblique angles, failing to penetrate. The Panther withdrew, leaving American crews to reckon with the limits of the round and the necessity of maneuver for better shot geometry. Baker's frustration was instructive. Accuracy of range estimate, favorable angle, and precise shot placement mattered as much as the cartridge itself. Commanders adapted tactics to squeeze value from every blue-tipped round. Platoons practiced coordinated approaches to force Panthers to present flanks or to aim for decisive mantlet shots. Tank formations were briefed to work with infantry scouts and reconnaissance to set up ambushes at ranges favorable to HVAP. Where armor superiority could not be assured, commanders used HVAP as a breaker. A single round to neutralize an enemy's main gun and create a window for combined arms follow-up, artillery, air, or infantry to finish the job. That close coordination between branches, tanks calling in artillery to finish immobilized vehicles, became more common where HVAP showed its potential. Allocation procedures formalized scarcity into tactical doctrine. With many Shermans carrying only 5 or so HVAP rounds in late 1944, battalion and regimental supply officers issued strict guidance. Prioritize anti-armor tasks. Tank destroyer units receive priority and reserve a token number for breakthrough or emergency counterattack uses. The supply reality shaped tactical posture. Companies that knew their HVAP stocks were low favored maneuver and combined arm solutions over frontal duels. Where units had sufficient HVAP, they fought differently, more willing to accept direct engagements once the possibility of penetration existed. In the Ardennes, This arbitrariness of supply meant some American units could blunt German armored thrusts with confidence, while others, shorn of blue-tipped rounds, had to rely on bazookas, artillery, or risky flanking. The human factor also included maintenance and logistics at the micro level. An HVAP round's ballistic advantage depended on barrel condition and consistent propellant quality. Crews learned to monitor barrel wear and to avoid firing large numbers of HVAP rounds in rapid succession, both to conserve the round and to prevent undue stress on barrels. The brittle tungsten cores also demanded careful handling. Damaged cartridges could fail to seat or feed properly. Ammunition handlers and loaders became essential specialists. The fastest loader didn't win if the wrong round went into the breech at a critical moment. Psychology amplified material effects. After Aracourt and similar actions where Panthers were suddenly vulnerable, battlefield rumor did what logistics could not. It multiplied the cartridge's effect. German crews saw Panther turrets breach and assumed enemy tanks now carried 90mm guns or British Fireflies. Their confusion and growing caution altered behavior. A single well-placed HVAP round delivered not only destruction but information. The enemy could be penetrated. That information, passed by word of mouth and official reports, quickly spread and reshaped engagement calculus on both sides. The Panthers' aura of invulnerability cracked. German tactics shifted toward defensive posturing and more cautious use of armor. Training emphasized that HVAP success was rarely solo heroics. A mantlet shot might require a spotter to call the range, a flanking unit to force the Panther into an exposed posture, and suppression fire from supporting infantry. The most effective HVAP employment occurred where combined arms and information flow were highest. Reconnaissance that found Panthers in hull-down positions and directed Shermans to approach on their weaker arcs. Artillery that suppressed nearby anti-tank assets while tanks closed for the right shot. Air observers that kept routes open for resupply of rare rounds. The lesson was already familiar in other forms. Technology is maximized by teamwork. There are also moral and leadership dimensions. Tank commanders face choices every day. Expend scarce HVAP now and risk being empty later, or hoard and hope that ideal moment presented itself. Effective leaders managed resources with tactical foresight. Poor leaders wasted valuable rounds in the heat of ego-driven duels. The after-action reports brim with both examples. Those who planned and controlled fire preserved ammunition and achieved better outcomes over sustained operations. The story of HVAP thus became a story about command discipline as much as metallurgy. Finally, learning accelerated. Early mistakes, shots wasted at oblique angles, rounds fired from too great distances, or wildly optimistic targeting, gave way to hardened practice. By late 1944 and into 1945, American armored schools and unit training emphasized HVAP-specific drills. Mantlet aiming, quick reloading under fire, coordination with infantry and artillery, and simulated resource-constrained engagements. Crews returned to depot schools with first-hand experience, passed techniques to replacements, and institutionalized what had once been improvisation. Its effectiveness depended on preserved muzzle velocity, acceptable impact angle, and proximity, the kind of tactical conditions that are not always available in fluid combat. The core material, tungsten carbide, was brittle. At lower impact velocities or shallow obliquities, it could shatter rather than penetrate. Logistical scarcity limited distribution. For many frontline Sherman units, the standard allotment by early 1945 was 5 or so rounds. That number could win a single duel, not an entire campaign. Those constraints drove painful but necessary choices at multiple levels. At the company and battalion level, commanders had to ration a weapon that could determine life or death in armored duels. Supply officers retooled priorities. Tank destroyer battalions and armored spearheads often received allocation preference. Infantry supporting Shermans received less. At corps and army levels, ordnance planners scrambled to expand production while balancing tungsten needs across aviation, tooling, and multiple ammunition programs. The statistical numbers tell the tale. production ramped painfully slowly. Initial monthly outputs were in the low thousands, and by March 1945, cumulative totals reached only in the tens of thousands. That scarcity shaped doctrine. Use HVAP when it mattered most, and in the meantime refine combined arms methods to win without it. The institutional lesson was unmistakable. Technical fixes can shift battlefield probabilities, but they rarely substitute for doctrine, training, or numbers. VAP's greatest strategic value was not that it made Shermans strictly equal to Panthers. It did not, but that it changed how crews fought and how commanders used armor. Psychological effects magnified material ones. German crews who saw mantlets penetrated began to doubt the absolute protection of their front armor. Hesitation replaced some of the aggressiveness that had characterized earlier operations. Even rumor of VAP's presence forced more cautious German dispositions and, in operational terms, ceded initiative to Allied commanders. Post-war, the HVP episode fed into several longer arcs of military technology and doctrine. First, ammunition design increasingly emphasized dense, hard penetrators and high muzzle velocities, the very principles HVP demonstrated. The lineage is clear. VAP's tungsten cores foreshadowed later penetrator technologies, including depleted uranium and advanced tungsten alloys used by modern main battle tanks. The basic physics did not change. Concentrate kinetic energy in a small, dense projectile at maximum feasible velocity. Second, industrial capacity and raw material access emerged as decisive strategic factors. The HVAP story underscored that an ingenious round is worthless unless factories can produce it in quantity and logistics can deliver it where needed. Germany had the ballistics knowledge to produce similar tungsten-cored projectiles, but lacked the raw materials and the secure, large-scale industrial base as the war progressed. The United States, by contrast, could marshal raw materials from global sources and sustain production lines, not perfectly or without bottlenecks, but at a scale that made operational difference. Third, doctrine evolved. American armor doctrine doubled down on combined arms. Tank, infantry, artillery, air, and reconnaissance working together to create the shot geometry HVAP needed. The war proved that weapons and tactics are a system. Feeding rounds to gunners without reconnaissance or infantry support yields mediocre results. Post-war armored schools taught lessons learned. Range discipline, target selection, integration with engineers and air observers, all patterns that trace back to VAP's operational use. The human legacy is no less important. Veterans who survived encounters with new ammunition carried those lessons into training and institutions. Officers who had wrestled with rationing and allocation later influenced procurement and doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Croton Abrams and others who fought in these armored engagements carried the premise: train the crew, stock the ammo, support with combined arms, into the Cold War era. The M1 Abrams family of tanks, decades later, reflects these accumulated understandings. Powerful guns, advanced penetrators, and the logistics to support sustained operations were designed into doctrine from the outset. There is also an ethical and historiographical legacy. VAP's emergence demonstrates the messy intersection of improvisation, material science, and wartime necessity. It forced historians to re-examine simplistic narratives that attribute victory to single weapons or single battles. Instead, the HVAP thread shows how many factors — metallurgy, industrial policy, logistics, small unit tactics, morale, and sheer chance — combined to reshape military outcomes. For every blue-tipped round that found its mark, countless supporting actions made that shot possible. Scouts who spotted Panthers in hull-down positions, loaders who kept rounds clean under fire, supplies sergeants who negotiated scarce allocations, and maintenance crews who kept barrels within tolerances. Finally, HVAP poses an enduring question about military institutions: how to balance standardization and innovation. The round itself was a product of focused research in ordnance labs. Its operational deployment required bypassing conventional procurement timelines and prioritizing scarce resources. The tension between the need for deliberative testing and the imperative for rapid fielding in wartime remains relevant today. Modern militaries still struggle with this trade-off. The rapid insertion of promising technologies versus the risk of logistics nightmares or unforeseen limitations. As the European War closed and attention shifted to occupation and reconstruction, HVAP receded as an urgent issue. Yet its technical and institutional fingerprints remained. The next generation of anti-armor solutions, from sabot rounds to shaped charges to kinetic energy penetrators, stand on foundations that HVAP helped validate. More broadly, the story reminds us that wars are decided by systems, not by single miracles. Raw material pipelines, engineering labs, production floors, tactical training, and the courage of frontline crews together determine outcomes. HVAP did not rewrite the laws of physics. It exploited them. It forced both sides to confront that metallurgy, logistics, and training matter as much as armor curves drawn on test benches. The rounds that first punched through Panther mantlets at Aracourt were small, heavy, and scarce, but they changed how men fought and how armies thought. That is VAP's true legacy, a reminder that even in an age of massive industry, tactical surprise and scientific insight can alter the balance on the battlefield, provided there is an organization ready to exploit them.